China had calculated that a massive naval demonstration would force American retreat from the Western Pacific. However, the 500-kilometer steel wall of warships Beijing deployed has transformed from a show of strength into a strategic trap from which the People's Liberation Army Navy cannot escape. On March 3, 2026, Chinese leadership issued unprecedented orders for phased withdrawal of naval assets from positions surrounding Taiwan, abandoning what state media had proclaimed as the final preparation for reunification. This reversal represents not a tactical adjustment but the collapse of a decade-long military strategy and approximately $400 billion in naval modernization investment within a matter of weeks. The images you are about to see on your screens show the largest peacetime naval concentration in modern history. What you see is not the triumph Beijing intended, but rather the moment when overwhelming force became overwhelming vulnerability. But that is not the most shocking detail. There are three critical factors that transformed China's naval blockade into a death trap. The first is the systematic targeting of Chinese logistics networks by coordinated Pacific allies wielding precision weapon systems China cannot counter. The second is the economic suffocation created when global shipping companies rerouted $12 trillion in annual trade away from Chinese-controlled waters. The third is the internal Communist Party crisis triggered when military expenditures on this operation reached levels that threatened social stability funding. We will explain each of these factors in the later parts of the video. Now we must look at how this crisis began. Now we descend to that first moment when it all began to the waters of the Taiwan Strait on February 18, 2026. The location you see on the screen is approximately 140 kilometers east of Fujian Province, where the People's Liberation Army Navy assembled what Chinese state television called the Great Wall at Sea. Satellite imagery documented the deployment of 127 major surface combatants, including 8 Type 055 cruisers, 23 Type 052D destroyers, and 42 Type 054A frigates forming concentric rings around Taiwan, at distances ranging from 50 to 500 kilometers from the island's coastline. The formation represented approximately 65% of China's operational blue water fleet concentrated in a single theater. According to reports from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, this deployment exceeded any previous Chinese naval operation in both scale and sophistication. The ships maintained formation using advanced network-centric warfare systems that connected every vessel into a unified combat grid. Each destroyer carried between 64 and 112 vertical launch cells loaded with a mixture of HHQ-9 long-range air defense missiles, YJ-18 anti-ship cruise missiles capable of Mach 3 terminal sprint speeds, and CJ-10 land attack cruise missiles with ranges exceeding 1,500 kilometers. The integrated air defense umbrella created what Chinese military publications described as an impenetrable shield covering 400,000 square kilometers of ocean. Below the surface, Type 093B nuclear attack submarines and Type 039C air-independent propulsion submarines established patrol zones designed to interdict any surface vessel attempting to breach the formation. Chinese military doctrine refers to this as the Anti-Access Area Denial Architecture, abbreviated as A2AD, which theoretically prevents enemy forces from operating within the defended zone. The deployment represented the operational manifestation of capabilities China had spent 2 decades developing specifically to counter American carrier strike groups. The tactical execution demonstrated sophisticated coordination. Maritime patrol aircraft, including H-6K bombers modified for anti-ship missions, and KJ-500 airborne early warning aircraft maintained continuous surveillance coverage. Ground-based DF-21D anti-ship ballistic missiles, which Western analysts call carrier killers, were positioned within range at multiple launch sites along China's southeastern coastline. The layered defense created what Beijing proclaimed as the most formidable naval barrier ever assembled in peacetime. Chinese President Xi Jinping appeared on state television declaring that the sacred mission of reunification had entered its final phase and that foreign interference would be met with resolute countermeasures. But the truly shocking detail is not the impressive display of naval power. The fatal flaw embedded within this massive deployment became apparent within 72 hours when logistics requirements transformed strength into catastrophic weakness. According to leaked port protocols analyzed by the Institute for the Study of War, maintaining 127 major surface combatants at sea requires approximately 47,000 tons of fuel, 2,800 tons of provisions, and continuous ammunition replenishment every 96 hours. The Chinese Navy lacks the at-sea replenishment capability possessed by the United States Navy, where American carrier strike groups operate with dedicated combat logistics force ships capable of underway replenishment allowing indefinite operations, Chinese vessels must return to port for resupply. The mathematics of naval logistics created an inescapable dilemma, with replenishment cycles requiring vessels to rotate back to Ningbo, Zhanjiang, Qingdao, and Yulin naval bases. The 500-kilometer wall developed gaps that widened with each passing day. Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force P-1 Maritime Patrol aircraft documented these rotation patterns, identifying predictable windows when coverage thinned to 40% of initial density. This intelligence was immediately shared with United States Indo-Pacific Command under the framework of the Japan-US Security Treaty. The replenishment vulnerability represented only the first layer of China's strategic miscalculation. The second emerged from coordinated Allied response that Beijing had not anticipated. On February 22, 2026, Japanese Prime Minister announced emergency legislation authorizing offensive strike capabilities under the constitutional reinterpretation of collective self-defense. Within 48 hours, Japan deployed Type 12 surface-to-ship missile batteries to Yonaguni Island, located just 110 kilometers from Taiwan and well within range of Chinese naval formations. These missiles, with ranges exceeding 400 kilometers and sea-skimming approach profiles, created an anti-ship threat emanating from territory Beijing could not strike without triggering the U.S.-Japan Mutual Defense Treaty and Article 5 equivalent commitments. South Korea followed with its own strategic repositioning. Seoul deployed indigenously produced Haeseong cruise missiles to forward positions and authorized patrol operations by Sejong the Great-class destroyers equipped with Aegis combat systems into waters adjacent to Chinese operating areas. According to Defense Ministry statements, these deployments were characterized as freedom of navigation exercises protecting vital sea lanes through which $340 billion in annual Korean trade passes. The positioning created additional targeting threats that forced Chinese commanders to expand defensive perimeters beyond sustainable limits. Australia contributed P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft operating from Butterworth Air Base in Malaysia, providing continuous surveillance that degraded Chinese submarine operations. The subsurface domain where China expected advantage transformed into a zone of vulnerability as coordinated Allied anti-submarine warfare capabilities including American Virginia-class attack submarines, Japanese Soryu-class boats, and Australian Collins-class submarines established hunter-killer patrols that forced Chinese submarines into defensive postures. The Philippines provided perhaps the most strategically significant contribution by granting enhanced defense cooperation, allowing American forces access to 5 additional bases including locations on Luzon facing the Taiwan Strait. These positions enabled deployment of high-mobility artillery rocket systems equipped with precision strike missiles capable of engaging maritime targets at ranges up to 499 kilometers. The geographic positioning meant Chinese vessels operating in their blockade formation faced precision fires from multiple directions that overwhelmed defensive capabilities. This brings us to the economic dimension that transformed military demonstration into strategic disaster. On February 24, 2026, Maersk, the world's largest container shipping company, announced immediate rerouting of all vessels away from waters within 600 kilometers of Chinese naval formations. Mediterranean Shipping Company, CMA CGM, and COSCO Shipping followed within hours. According to industry analysis from Lloyd's List Intelligence, these decisions rerouted approximately 22% of global container traffic, representing $4 trillion in annual trade value. The rerouting created a cascading economic crisis that reached far beyond military considerations. Shanghai Port, which handles 47 million TEUs, annually making it the world's busiest container facility, experienced traffic reductions of 34% within 1 week as vessels diverted to Singapore, Busan, and even Los Angeles rather than risk proximity to potential conflict zones. The economic impact rippled through China's export-dependent economy with particular severity in Guangdong and Zhejiang provinces, where manufacturing relies on just-in-time global supply chains. Insurance markets compounded the crisis. War risk premiums for vessels transiting within 500 kilometers of the Taiwan Strait increased from baseline rates of 0.02% of hull value to 5%, making insurance costs exceed cargo values for many shipments. According to reports from shipping industry publications, this pricing effectively created an exclusion zone far larger than any military blockade could enforce. Global supply chains that had taken decades to optimize around Chinese manufacturing began rewiring within days, with procurement managers and multinational corporations initiating emergency diversification to Vietnam, India, Mexico, and Eastern European production facilities. The financial markets delivered their own verdict. Foreign investment outflows from Chinese markets reached $89 billion in the first week of March 2026, according to data from the Institute of International Finance. The Shanghai Composite Index declined 18% despite circuit breaker interventions by the China Securities Regulatory Commission. The offshore yuan depreciated 7% against the dollar as capital flight accelerated through both legal channels and underground banking networks. The economic consensus that had positioned China as indispensable manufacturer to the world began dissolving as buyers discovered that diversification away from Chinese suppliers, while disruptive, was achievable within acceptable timeframes. But wait, the nightmare this economic collapse created for Beijing does not end there. The domestic political crisis triggered by military expenditures and economic disruption threatened the very foundation of Communist Party legitimacy. According to analysis from Chinese domestic social media monitoring conducted by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, censored posts revealed growing public anger over the costs of the naval operation. The deployment required mobilization of approximately 127,000 naval personnel, plus supporting logistics and Air Force elements, straining a military that faces recruitment challenges as China's working-age population shrinks. The financial burden proved unsustainable. Maintaining the naval formation required estimated daily expenditures of $340 million for fuel, provisions, maintenance, and operational costs. Over a 30-day deployment, this totaled $2 billion in direct costs, not including the economic damage from disrupted trade and investment flight. These expenditures came at a moment when China's central government faced mounting fiscal pressures from slowing economic growth, a collapsing real estate sector that had destroyed approximately $18 trillion in household wealth, and local government debt exceeding $9 trillion. The social stability implications created the ultimate crisis for party leadership. China's governance model depends on an implicit social contract where citizens accept authoritarian political control in exchange for rising living standards and economic opportunity. The naval deployment threatened this bargain directly. Youth unemployment officially reached 21.3% in February 2026, though independent analysis suggests actual rates exceed 35% when including discouraged workers. The economic disruption triggered by the Taiwan operation pushed major employers, including technology firms and manufacturers, to announce hiring freezes and layoffs affecting an estimated 4.7 million workers. Public services faced immediate funding shortages as provincial governments diverted resources to support the military operation. According to leaked internal party documents reported by Radio Free Asia, protests erupted in 23 cities across 12 provinces when local governments announced delays in pension payments, reductions in healthcare coverage, and suspension of infrastructure projects that had provided employment for surplus workers. The demonstrations, while quickly suppressed, revealed fragility and social stability that terrified party leadership more than any external military threat. This scene is tragic enough to go down in modern naval history. A fleet designed to project power and achieve national reunification instead accelerated economic decoupling, triggered capital flight, and revealed domestic vulnerabilities that undermined regime security. The expression on the face of Chinese naval commanders as they received withdrawal orders was not fear of American military power, but rather the utter helplessness of officers caught in a strategic miscalculation that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. President Xi Jinping's strategy had been based entirely on assumptions that proved catastrophically wrong. He assumed that overwhelming naval force would intimidate Taiwan into negotiations while deterring American intervention. Instead, the deployment unified Pacific allies, accelerated military cooperation Beijing had spent years trying to prevent, and demonstrated that China's geographic position surrounded by American allies and partners created strategic disadvantages that naval modernization could not overcome. He assumed that global economic dependence on Chinese manufacturing provided leverage that would prevent coordinated economic response. Instead, the supply chain rewiring that COVID-19 pandemic had initiated accelerated as corporations concluded that China risk exceeded China benefit. Most critically, Xi assumed that the Chinese Communist Party's control mechanisms could manage domestic reaction to economic disruption and military expenditure. Instead, the operation revealed that the party's legitimacy rested on performance legitimacy that military nationalism could not replace. When economic growth slowed and living standards threatened to decline, nationalist pride proved insufficient compensation for material hardship. The withdrawal orders issued on March 3 attempted to frame the pullback as a successful completion of training exercises that had achieved their objectives of demonstrating readiness and resolve. State media emphasized that China had shown its capability to conduct large-scale naval operations, and that reunification remained the sacred mission that would be achieved when conditions were optimal. The propaganda attempted to transform obvious retreat into strategic patience, claiming that the deployment had served its purpose by warning Taiwan and foreign interference forces of consequences they would face if they continued down the path of separatism. But the framing could not hide the reality visible to informed observers both internationally and within China's own elite circles. According to German intelligence reports analyzing Chinese military communications, the withdrawal created internal military criticism of political leadership for ordering operations without ensuring adequate logistics support, economic preparation, or alliance management. Senior People's Liberation Army officers privately questioned whether political demands for nationalist demonstrations had overridden military professional assessment of operational feasibility. The strategic implications extend far beyond this single episode. China's naval withdrawal revealed fundamental constraints on Chinese power projection that will shape Indo-Pacific strategic calculations for years to come. Despite 2 decades of naval modernization that created the world's largest fleet by hull count, China lacks the at-sea replenishment capability, the network of overseas bases, and the alliance structures that enable sustained power projection. The geographic reality that China operates from interior positions surrounded by American allies and partners creates permanent disadvantages that shipbuilding cannot overcome. The economic dimension proved even more consequential. The swift supply chain rewiring demonstrated that Chinese manufacturing, while significant, was not irreplaceable given sufficient economic incentive to diversify. Multinational corporations discovered that Vietnam, India, Mexico, and Eastern European nations could absorb manufacturing capacity faster than previously assumed. The decoupling that American policymakers had advocated for security reasons but hesitated to pursue due to economic costs suddenly became economically rational as China risk premiums exceeded efficiency gains from Chinese manufacturing. The domestic political impact may prove most significant of all. The episode revealed that Chinese Communist Party legitimacy remains performance-based despite decades of nationalist propaganda and political control. When economic disruption threatened living standards, nationalist pride proved insufficient to maintain social stability. This fundamental vulnerability constrains future Chinese military adventures regardless of capabilities development. So what happens now? The immediate future involves careful choreography as both sides attempt to de-escalate without appearing to concede. Chinese naval vessels will return to port in staggered rotations characterized as normal operational cycles rather than retreat. State media will emphasize successful training objectives achieved and readiness demonstrated. American and allied forces will maintain enhanced presence while avoiding triumphalist rhetoric that would back Chinese leadership into corners requiring face-saving responses. The medium-term consequences reshape Indo-Pacific strategic architecture. Japan's constitutional reinterpretation allowing offensive strike capabilities represents permanent expansion of Tokyo's security role that will continue regardless of immediate crisis resolution. South Korea's forward deployments and Australia's enhanced cooperation similarly represent strategic shifts that persist beyond this episode. The Philippines' provision of base access creates enduring American presence advantages. These alliance developments collectively represent the true strategic defeat China suffered through this naval deployment. The long-term trajectory suggests that China's window for military reunification with Taiwan, if such a window ever existed, has closed rather than opened. The deployment demonstrated that attempting forcible reunification would trigger coordinated Allied response, economic decoupling, and domestic instability that together exceed Chinese capacity to manage. Taiwan's de facto independence becomes more entrenched as the costs of changing the status quo through force prove prohibitive. This could turn into a deadly lesson for Beijing about the limits of military power in an economically integrated world defended by networked alliances. China built a navy but not a sustainable naval logistics system. China developed precision weapons, but not the alliance structures that make power projection feasible. China created economic interdependence but discovered that interdependence cuts both ways and that substitutes exist when strategic necessity demands them. Will the South China Sea see similar challenges to Chinese maritime claims as neighboring nations emboldened by this episode press territorial disputes? Will the Belt and Road Initiative face increased resistance as partners recalculate Chinese reliability and staying power? Will internal party dynamics shift as Xi Jinping's strongman leadership faces subtle criticism for strategic overreach that damaged Chinese interests? Only time will tell, but the signs suggest China's moment of maximum danger may have passed as the costs of military adventurism became undeniable. The strategic environment China confronts today is fundamentally more challenging than the environment Xi Jinping inherited when he assumed power in 2012. The alliance structures arrayed against Chinese expansion have strengthened rather than weakened. The economic dependencies that Beijing assumed provided leverage have proven reversible. The domestic political stability that appeared unshakable has revealed fragility that constrains external adventures. China's rise has not continued on the trajectory that extrapolations in the 2010s suggested was inevitable. At TGN, we will keep following this global strategic realignment as it unfolds. The retreat of Chinese naval forces from Taiwan waters represents not an isolated incident, but rather a revealing moment when aspirations collided with constraints and reality imposed its verdict. The images of that 500-kilometer steel wall that was supposed to cage Taiwan instead becoming a trap for Chinese naval power will endure as a symbol of the gap between military hardware and genuine strategic capability. The naval formation that Chinese state media celebrated as the Great Wall at Sea turned out to be more like the Maginot Line, an impressive static defense that strategic reality rendered obsolete before it achieved its intended purpose. The comparison is particularly apt because both represented massive investments in military capability that failed to account for how adversaries would adapt and how broader strategic contexts would evolve. China built the ships but could not build the logistics systems, alliance structures, economic resilience, and domestic political stability required to employ those ships effectively in sustained operations against coordinated opposition. What are your thoughts on this strategic reversal and what it means for the future of Indo-Pacific security? Do you think China will attempt another naval demonstration, or has Beijing learned that military theater cannot substitute for sustainable strategy? Don't forget to share your thoughts on this topic in the comments section. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like our video. China set out to cage Taiwan and intimidate the Pacific. Today, Beijing finds itself forced to withdraw from positions that revealed vulnerability rather than strength, trapped by logistics it cannot sustain, economics it cannot control, and domestic pressures it cannot ignore. The Great Wall at Sea has crumbled not under enemy fire but under the weight of its own contradictions. Presented by TGN. Thank you for choosing us.